Hello and welcome to the Author Talks webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Arts in Writing, the Master of Art in Science Writing, and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Elise Levine on her new short story collection, Big of You. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Author Talks playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to Karen Hooper, Program Director for the MA in Writing program.
Hello and welcome students, faculty, and alumni of the MA in Writing program and the Science Writing program. We're so glad that you could join us this evening for this author talk with Elise Levine, our esteemed faculty member. And I would like to begin by introducing one of our current students, Susan Edwards, who will be the moderator for this conversation. And we'll introduce Elise. Susan.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Karen. And hello and welcome to everyone. We're so excited that you could be with us this evening. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Natalie and Peter for their technical advice. They're the event producers and have a lot of experience, so this should go very smoothly. It's my great pleasure and honor to be asked to introduce Professor Elise Levine this evening and to serve as moderator for a discussion of her most recently published collection of short stories, Big of You. Elise, hello and welcome.
Hello. Hi, Susan. Thank you.
Good to have you here. We want to be sure that there's plenty of time for all of your questions. And so in addition to saving some time at the end, we'll stop after each reading and Peter will pick up some of your questions if they're in the Q&A. And please remember to form it in as a question so that we can do that. And any we can't get to along the way, we'll pick up again at the end. So thank you very much. In addition to being the author of the 2025 story collection, Big of You, the book we're discussing for the next hour, Elise Levine has published 2 novellas, 2 novels, and 2 previous story collections. Her work has appeared in Ploughshares, Copper Nickel, and was included 5 times in Best Canadian Stories. She is the recipient of awards and fellowships from the Canada Council for the Arts, Yaddo, and MacDowell, among others. She lives in Baltimore and is a member, as we know, of the faculty in the MA in Writing program at Johns Hopkins University. And if you do not already have a copy, run right out to your independent bookstore and get one now, or not now, but after the program, and then be sure to pick up plenty for the holidays to give as gifts. So I just a little plug for that. And to kick things off this evening, I'd like to read 2 apt blurbs about Big of You from Kirkus Review, because they really summarize things very poignantly. Okay, the first is, quote, throughout the writing is like a modernist poem filled with startling images, but also half thoughts and half sentences, leaving the reader, like the characters, on the tender hooks of understanding. Fiction that makes artful demands and in return offers substantial rewards. And the second, that's end quote, and the second one is, quote, the stories of Elise Levine's latest collection, Big of You, are great travelers. They move through time, scene, and setting like water, seamless and fluid, burbling with questions of personal identity and what it takes to change one's present or put to bed one's past, end quote. Now, at least several of your stories feature overlapping characters or are connected in other ways. As a historian, I was enchanted by Once, Then Suddenly Later, about the 19th century photographer Felix Nadar and his brother, written by Ivy Siegel, who is mentioned in Return to Forever, and again in the heartbreaking and poetic story, Take 10. Similarly, you have connected Penetrating Wind over Open Lake and Sounds Like. And the opening story is Arnheim. And the third story in the collection, Dig. Together, these cover a 40-year history of childhood friends. And could you begin by reading to us from Dig?
Sure, that would be great. Thank you. And thank you so much for that introduction and for agreeing to moderate tonight. I'm really thrilled that we're going to be in conversation. As Susan mentioned, I'm going to read, it's the third story in the book. It's called Dig, and it features the same narrator as in the first story. In this case, she's many years older and debatably wiser. I don't know, much wiser. I'm going to start partway into the story with I guess it's the fourth section. The narrator, she's on a trip to Venice. She's attended a conference there, and she's feeling quite unsettled for a number of reasons, many of which are revealed later in the story. At this point in the story, she chances upon the older brother of her best friend from childhood. And these two characters, the brother and the best friend, are featured prominently. They sort of form the core of the first story in the book. One more thing I'll say about this. What I'm going to read it's a flashback. This is the longest story in the book. It's about 35 pages. And because of that, I felt that I could leg out a little bit with this flashback. I felt that I could do a longer flashback than I normally would with a much shorter story, just in terms of proportion of, present action to flashback and backstory. And I don't think I need to say anything else. I think it'll be self-explanatory. You carry me in your arms. Down and down the steep steps from the cottage your grandfather built, while I flicker in and out of consciousness, geraniums and birches and blue morning sky swiftly growing dark. At bottom, you fold me into the back seat of the neighbor's car for the 12-mile drive to the hospital, and I can hear the muffled, worried voices of your mother and sister nearby. I've knocked myself out. Pre-breakfast with your sib, my best friend. The two of us, 15, going on 7, and thick as thieves, capering about the crooked patio, mostly her chasing sidekick, me. I fling myself from her lunging grasp into a rotting wicker chair and upend backward and headfirst onto a stone planter, get up, shake and sputter until the black wings of tunnel vision sweep me away and I crash for real. I come to, squashed helplessly against your torso, squeamish at this touch I've longed for throughout girlhood, having worshipfully conferred upon you the status of first hot crush I share with your fierce, fevered sister. That morning, I sustain a mild head injury and suffer an afternoon of rest, lightly brain-struck. Unleashed from your sister's hectic, seductive masterminding of our days, free to wend my way through an unabridged Moby Dick in the cool shade of my bottom bunk, forbidden the sunny beach. Beyond the window, sunlight shifts aquatic through green leaves. In my rumpled white sundress, I drowse and wake to a clarion stillness. I am the whale, the words. Call me not Ishmael nor Melville, but my own mask. At age 15, solo in my bunk at your family cottage, in the smuggled rest of a semi-sleep paralysis, for the first time I apprehend the certitude, though not the shape or material, not the truths, not yet the complexities of my owned marks. But what I never could have predicted, that very night, a partying motorcycle gang shows up at the nearby bayfront, just a few dirt roads away from this small cabin with no landline, this in the days long before mobiles. By 11 o'clock, your mother and sister and I huddle in silence by the sagging couch in the living room, while you stand guard at the picture window, gripping a splintery tennis racket, peering without your glasses into the trees. I feel for you then, sorry for you, embarrassed on your behalf. You've been thrust into this great protector role, firstborn and recently crowned man of the house, given your parents' recent separation, and now you're plunged far deeper than in your morning rescue of me. Honestly, what can you do if things truly go south? A rustling of branches. My feet hover above the floor. My flannel nightie, stained with honey and butter and pineapple juice from multiple breakfasts, sways against my legs. The night air strains through the window screens like a living creature rearing, tentacles of male laughter and glass breaking, engines revving, infinitely more alarming and thrilling than the usual nocturnal visits from raccoons bumping through the outdoors garbage cans for moldy peaches and chicken bones. My hair stands on end. I can't say it's fear that grips me, just this rising, a leave-taking, like nearly falling asleep and knowing it, toggling back and forth between worlds. Suddenly, you tip your head toward us, teeth bared, the look pure rage, as if we're the enemy, more like a smell, more bitter and chemical than sweat. Inside me, a headlong shower of dust to dust, space junk. Then my bare toes grasp the hooked rug again, and I lock my knees. In Venice, outside the Doge's palace, I survived my first witness of you in decades, the death ray you laser in my direction, even though I must be ancient history for you, as your sister, my long abandoned former best friend, is for me, and must be for you, her long ago hero, the hero she created and held fast to, your sister who I left, and you left too. I make it official. I am dead done for the day.
Thank you so much. That really takes us to Venice. I do see there's one Q&A from Anita. Anita, I'm fascinated by the fact that you chose to write about astronauts in space. How did you decide on that setting, an emotional weather system? So we're going to another story, obviously. You ready? Want to take that one?
Sure. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So that's one of three parts in the second story in the book, which is called Cooler. The first part features a casino worker. The second part is the astronaut on a space station at some point in the future. And the third part is a roadside attraction somewhere in, I guess, most likely the southwestern desert in the US, and features a millennia-old kind of curmudgeonly being. So the astronaut, so that story was a little unusual for me. The idea came to me sort of as a concept. What are different ways of thinking of the idea of cool, being cool? So each of the three parts features characters who are dealing with distance, detachment, coldness in their emotional coldness, psychological coldness in their lives. And they're also in some ways trying to be cool. They're trying to cling to this distance and detachment. So in all three of those parts, the characters, there's a sense of they're trying sort of very retro lingo, and thinking that they're kind of hip for doing it. But the reader, my hope is that the reader understands that this language isn't quite landing, and that there's some humor in that as well, and also some, I hope, some pathos as well. How did I dream up this idea for this millennia-old building being and this astronaut? They just, I mean, it sounds very mysterious, and I wish I had a more rational answer, but they just sort of popped into my head as soon as I was thinking of this idea of coolness. What is cooler than cool? And that's typically for the way for me. Just when I have ideas for stories or for novels, it's like they just appear to me, and they're a sense of character, maybe a sense of place, a sense of what the character is being challenged by. And it's a strong sense. I mean, I have lots of ideas, but many of those ideas, they're just sort of, they feel weak, but some of the ideas just feel very strong. And I'll start just taking notes, and because I'm usually working on something else at the same time as I have those ideas. So I'll just note them, and over time, more ideas will accrue. This is also how I know, oh, this is something that I can actually work on and develop, because more ideas, lines, sometimes opening lines will come to me, sometimes closing lines. And then I have to figure out how to link those things. But thanks for that question. But as for astronaut, I'm really not sure why that came.
So kind of a follow-up on that, Natalia asked, what is the millennial old being? And I was trying to figure out what the creature could be. And what did you imagine it to be?
Well, I imagined it as almost sort of a merman kind of creature with sort of this sort of shrunken in size because it's so old, although he keeps talking about how large he is, and how he once was giant. He in the story he lived at the time of the dinosaurs, but now he's this sort of shrunken thing in a glass display case, with a tail, a sort of a fish-like tail, but you sort of, I guess, more amphibian, with legs, and a spine, which he claims was once, had spikes 50 feet tall. I mean, he's grandiloquent, he's grandiose, he's in the grips of tremendous self-deception. And now he's sort of this kind of shriveled creature, scaly, dandruffy, dusty. But his lips are sort of, he still has this snarl, with which he believes that he's still frightening people. So that's how I envisioned him, um, as I was working on it. I tried to make him sort of believe that he was ferocious, and yet that we understand that he's in a very and that he's a monster, and he was a monster in the past. I mean, you know, responsible for killing people, doing terrible things. But now he's at the mercy of the owner of this roadside attraction, and there's some room for pathos, for feeling empathy toward him.
Okay, so and Natalia had another question back more about dig, and your how do you decide on morality in something like incest? So are you
Okay,
comfortable
so
to address that for us? Yeah.
sure. So thank you, Natalia. That's a great question. So in the first of those two linked stories, the first story in the collection is called Arnhem. Toward the end, the main character reveals that she knew, that she had kind of mostly been in denial, but she kind of knew that her best friend and her best friend's brother, there had been incestuous relations between them. And the main character is sort of just at a point in her life where she's just really stuck on thinking about that she had in some ways played the third wheel, with this relationship between the three of them. So in the story Dig, this is much more developed. She confronts it much more. And really what she's confronting is why she still gives the brother something of a pass, why she still thinks to some extent the best friend was manipulating, both herself, the narrator, and also manipulating the brother. And she's wrestling with this. So the morality in that story is doubly complex. But the incest is named, and it's named toward the end as the character is sort of, has to name it for herself, for what it is. And also, it's a moment in her life where she's, instead of resenting her friend, this is a resentment she's carried for decades. She's finally sort of understanding the sister a little bit, and still though struggling with those early, infatuations she had with the brother. So that's a really great question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Listen, David, we're going to come back to your question about getting an agent and publisher at the end, because I'm sure everyone wants to know something about that. But I'd like to pose a question before we ask Elise to read for us again. But I'm interested in the architecture of your story collection. And at what point in your writing, the short story collection, do you know which stories will be interconnected or how they're going to flow? Um, because they do, even though they're in different sections. So could you talk to Liz? I know you dressed up, but could you give us a little more about the architecture of how you put this together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the process for this book this story collection was very different for me than it was for my first two collections. For those, I would write a story and then I would just write the next story. And then when I put them together, I sort of put them together in an order that seemed to make sense to me. But I was just kind of feeling my way through the process, sort of by the seat of my pants at that point. This was very different. I was finishing my previous book, which was the collection of two linked novellas, and I started to have some ideas for short stories, for new short stories that I thought might sit together. Once I finished the novella, once that was completely off my plate, I sat down to really start thinking about the stories, and within a week, I dropped some of those initial ideas. I had new ideas. I had the titles. I had the order in which the 9 stories, the order in which they would appear. And then I sat down and over 5 years, that was the order in which I wrote those stories. And I also, from the outset, in that 1 week, it sort of like was, probably a once in a lifetime lightning striking kind of moment. It was quite remarkable. But I knew that some of the characters would be connected, like in the first story and the third story, with the narrator who's dealing with that sort of incestuous past of her friends. Um, Other stories as well. One connection I didn't realize until later, which you alluded to in your introduction, Susan. You're talking about the historical fiction about Félix Tournachon Nadar, the photographer. Later, in another story, it's revealed that one of the characters wrote the story, although really I wrote the story. And then the second last story, that character who putatively wrote the story, has a little bit of say. She's a character in a memory care ward. She has dementia. So that came later. Other methods of linking the stories, as I was working on each story, I would say, oh, the story 3 stories from now, this will hook up with this. There are lots of little things, little motifs. For example, in the excerpt that I read tonight from Dig, the character has a concussion. She knocks herself out and has a concussion. In a later story, and I think the last story in the collection, the character has had concussions or spaces out at certain times in the story, so there are little things. There are, or character with memory loss, this idea of gaps in consciousness. So a lot of little things. And as I was working on them, even up to the end, I would think, oh, I can, subtle ways of braiding things together, that the reader might not even notice, but my hope is that unconsciously, it will just help bind the collection together. But the large scale ones are those pairs of linked characters.
I hope you will let you read again in just 1 second, but I am captivated by voice, which changes in some of the stories. And one that from Dig is more traditional. But I love some of the modernist, very poetic language, which, well, I love poetry anyway. I hope other people tuning in are attracted to it. But it's a particularly appealing and, for me, rewards the careful attention and also rereading. So I think, this is a collection of stories that as I've said, I've already read several of them 3 times, but I know I will read it, cover to cover again. But could you say something about how you hear yourself in your head, and then you translate this sort of original and compelling voice to print? Is that possible?
Yeah, and again, that's such an important question, and I think as fiction writers, we're always thinking about voice, right? I mean, it's so central to character and the tone and the register of the story. I don't see it as my voice at all. I never do when I'm writing. I feel like giving voice to the character or the voice of the story, especially if it's depending on the point of view. So all of these stories are in first person point of view. One of the stories, first person plural. I kind of cheated a little bit with that, but still first person. But there's still a range though. So for example, in the first story, Arnhem, the voice of that character it's more, and the register, the tone, it's more kind of tamped. I think of it as sort of tamped down, more restrained, um, uh, more neutral. Sometimes I think flat, but I don't think it's flat, but more neutral, of a neutral voice. 30 years later, when we see this character in the story Dig, the third story in the book, um, she's mature, she's much more in command of herself. She's having a really up and down visit to Venice. Um, so many different things are going on in her life at this time. I wouldn't say she's a basket case, but she's contending with a lot of things, and she's very capable of contending with them as well. The language is really different. The language is much more open, longer sentences, more complex syntax, some longer paragraphs, although punctuated with some short paragraphs as well. Multiple sections, not just multiple paragraphs. So the voice is much more, I think of it as sort of swingy. It kind of swings low, up and down quite a bit more to show how emotionally volatile she is at this moment. She's in command, but she's also allowing herself much more of a range than we saw in the first story in the book. There's another later story in the book called Sounds Like, which again brings back a character from an earlier story, but now he's the central character and Sounds Like. And again, that's a more muted voice. I think of that, the voice of that character is similar to the first story, kind of not flat, but detached, to show a character who's sort of they're trying to keep everything together by repressing everything. So there's a range in the stories, and then the historical fiction with the 19th century photographer in Paris. I didn't feel I could mimic what someone of that class in 19th century Paris would speak like. But I use certain devices to try to get some sense that this is not a contemporary voice speaking. There was it was more formal, for example.
So before we ask you to read again, I want to follow up just on exactly what you said, because I find it very challenging and to when you're writing historical fiction and you're modifying historical facts and scenes. Could you share your approach to research? Not so much where to start, but when to stop, because you never bore us with going on and on and on, which it's tempting, because if you know the history, you want to tell it all, and you do this with such a light touch, but it's so every word is necessary and important in that writing. Could you just address that about historical fiction here?
Well, thank you for the compliment. I'm glad that worked for you. That came through many drafts. I'm probably too embarrassed to say how many, but oh gosh, I probably worked on that story for at least a year. Sometimes just dedicated day after day, and other times putting it aside for a while, working on something else, and then going back to it. So I had so much more material than what is now in the story. Tournechamp's experiments with photographing women from a mental institution, a notorious mental institution in Paris, and trying to capture spirits, and some of his writing about photographic subjects are actually, it's a way of rendering them dead. I mean, all sorts of things. So I had a lot in there about that, and I just kept going back and reading through from the beginning, though, of my story, and thinking this is just not, it's not fiction. It's not working as fiction.
Right.
Are there other ways to convey some of this? So that is a huge, huge challenge. I found that was a challenge too with another story that's not historical fiction. Penetrating Wind Over Open Lake is the name of the story. And in it, there's a student music composer, and she's very interested in the music of John Cage, and she's throwing John Cage, the composer, the great modernist composer, would throw the I Ching every day when he was composing, and he had a very highly systematized way of using the I Ching to help in his compositions. Well, she's throwing the I Ching and using it in sort of a psychological, emotional way, just to help her get through her challenging days in the program she's in and with her boyfriend. So I did all this research on John Cage, and I had pages and pages. And again, I just thought, oh my gosh, people want to read about John Cage. They can go and read about John Cage. This is not the place for it. So I think, you don't want the exposition to overpower the character, the narrative. My fiction writing is extremely character driven. Style, voice, all of that arises from character. It's in service to character. Ideas, the research, the history, it needs to be in service to the character and that character development or arc. Or if the character doesn't develop, I mean, that still, to me, can be very compelling and moving. But so somehow transforming that exposition or realizing that you might have found something utterly fascinating, but your reader might not have. And sometimes I think that just comes through a long process. At least for me, it does many, many, many drafts, tons of notes, and just trying to figure out the different layers of the character.
Thank you. And so why don't we, can I ask you to read again? I think, would you like to read from Witchwell since you mentioned it?
Yeah, sure. That would be great.
And we're having lots of good questions. So we will, and there's some statements in the Q&A that I know that Elise will get to and read herself. We'll just try to answer those that are formed as questions. But if you'll read for us one more time, and then we'll break again for more questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And I'm glad we have lots of questions. That's very exciting. Okay, so this is the last story in the collection, Witchwell. And I'm just going to read the opening section. It's quite short. Give you a sense of some of the dialogue in the book. I don't think I need to explain anything. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. On a midsummer morning, I enter the Frozens. Alan, inescapable. He waves energetically from his end by the ice creams, then launches his cart, hands cupped around his mouth. Incoming, he calls out. Clear the decks. A wobble of wheels across the waxed floor, a faint metal tink where his carriage's nose boops mine. Boop, my friend Alan says. Not today, Alan, I say. Not today. As if in a horror flick, he is suddenly right beside me. How did that happen? Cue the spooky laughter, his. He touches my wrist as if to summon me. I hold out, unmoved, selecting against the category of good times gal. His face blanks, then falls, and I roll by. Darla, he screams, trying a new tack, sounding very black and white and Brando, and startling the young couple by the tofu scrambles. Hey, Darla. I lift my finger in a backward-facing salute. Darla doll, he yodels, and I'm not sure whose part he is acting now. Oh, my darl. I click my heels along the aisle, hesitate by the microwave stir-fries. I put my nose to the glass. My breath puffs a ghost over my reflection. Be a doll, darl, he wheedles. Can't you, just for once, let me be here for you? All it takes is once. If I allow my friend Alan to be here for me, then I must return the favor and be here for my friend Alan. A universal law in these fair parts. Just once is the tipping point, the point of no return. Last chance, Alan says with a chuckle, his good nature on power display. Offer expires soon, he says. How soon, I'm unsure. I have spaced again, one of the spells I keep experiencing lately. I come to at the waffles, the breakfast burritos. I allow they look pretty good. I admit they remind me of something. A noisy kitchen, burnt toast, the flutter of small hands waving away curls of smoke, laughter, cries of not again. Darla? Having none of it, I gather steam, torque the corner, poof.
All right. Thank you so much. Which writers and works would you say influenced you the most for this particular collection and why? And it's a part 2 question. Also, how do you feel that your collection and its themes hits our zeitgeist now versus when you may have started conjuring this collection?
Wow, those are both really excellent questions. So I think in terms of influences for this book, let me see. So linked story collections. So I'll kind of group these in different ways. Linked story collections that I had read, you know, either before or as I was working on this book that I really loved and thought were terrifically well done. Although probably stylistically I was working in a different way. Tommy Orange's first book called There. Just an absolutely terrific book with picking up characters at different stages of their life and within a community, which mine doesn't do. But he had lots of wonderful linking devices, and the characters, the voices are so alive and so, you know, contemporary. And I learned a lot about from that book about just characterization for one thing. Let me see. Probably Jennifer Egan's Pulitzer Prize winning story collection, A Visit from the Goon Squad. Just how precise her writing is and the formal risks she takes. There are so many different voices and she uses different forms as well. And they work so well within a collection, and the collection as a whole has an architecture to it and feels extremely shaped. So I mean, that was, you know, that's sort of like, I don't know, being starting out as a boxer and looking up to Muhammad Ali or something. Like I don't know, I don't have, sorry, I don't have, you know, more recent sports references for that, but probably I was thinking a lot about those books. Other writers who I just love, Yoko Ogawa is a Japanese writer who I've read in translation, and I love her books, her novels. She has a collection of 3 novellas that I call The Diving Pool, which she uses genre in her. It's literary fiction. There are hints of horror, hints of the absurd, the surreal, and she also has another story collection called Revenge, which again uses sort of genre in really interesting ways, which I do in Big of You. There are stories that, well, Witchwell, certainly there are little hints of horror in it, very much fabulous elements in some of the other stories as well. So the second part of your question was?
The zeitgeist for the moment.
The zeitgeist. Well, I from the start, I had this idea of wanting to, I was really interested in writing about strivers, writing about ambition in the world that at least many of us are living in right now. And, you know, how our ambitions, you know, can lead us to have an extended capacity for self-deceit and also for being exploited as well. So I was interested in seeing these characters strive, having their expectations of themselves and their situations punctured, and recognizing their capacities for self-deceit. I you know, and that was in part why I wanted to use these fabulous or surreal elements. I thought that those would help me get at the changes that over time personhood can entail. And I thought that it just seemed to me that that's the world we're living in right now. We're always enjoined to produce, and I'm certainly no exception. I'm always feel like I can't get to my next book or the next thing I want to be working on. But sort of to just take a step back and see that modeled with different characters at different stages in their lives, different situations, how they're dealing with that at this particular time. So thank you for those questions.
Yeah, that's great. And we have a question from Kim. I'm a Canadian writer living and studying in the US, so I'm curious, has moving between the Canadian and American literary worlds changed or influenced your writing?
That is a really great, that's probably a question I ask myself at least once a week, if not every day at times. Thank you, Kim. Well, I mean, living in, I think, crossing borders, living in different countries, especially two countries where sometimes it's hard to put your finger on the cultural differences. Um, and yet Canada has, this amazing literature that sometimes Americans might forget about. So that certainly it gives me it's almost like a double vision, I would say. Um,
Mm.
so I'm often reading Canadian books. I have lots of Canadian writer friends, so I'm very aware of that. But I'm sometimes trying to sort of bring that to my U.S. writing friends, the U.S. writers that I know. It's definitely, in some ways, feels like a different world to me in a lot of ways because um, obviously Canadian culture is very different. Canadian educational system is very, very different than the U.S. system. It's funny, though I've lived in the US now nearly 30 years, but I still, well, I've always lived close to the Canadian border, so I've always felt it until very recently that it was easy to go back and forth. Um, so it's, it is something I'm really aware of. I love seeing Canadian writers being recognized in the US. Of course, I was thrilled. A friend of mine, Mark Anthony Jarman, who is the most amazing short story writer. My publisher did a selected stories of his recently, and it got just an absolutely rave review in the New York Times. That was really exciting to see him getting that recognition here in the US. But I think it gives a sense of um, being a little bit of an outsider, a bit of a, sort of witness, a bit of sense of duality. And I think ultimately that's can be really, depending on how you channel it, I think that can be really valuable as a writer to feel slightly. I mean, I think community is an incredibly important thing for a writer to have, but I think also to have at the same time a little bit of step back and feel that that you're more of an observer in other ways as well can be very, very helpful. So thank you, Kim, for that question.
So that reminds me of the issue of community. And so are you in a writers group or have you ever been in a writers group or do you recommend that, especially for those of us about to graduate and move on where we won't have workshops so often anymore? Can you speak to that? Yeah.
Yes to almost all of that. I'm not currently in a writers group, but when I was first starting out seriously, when I reached the point in my life where I said, if I don't do this now, I will expire very soon. I was in two different writers groups. I started taking workshops at community colleges in continuing ed classes. These were continuing ed classes in Toronto, and quickly met up with what felt like my spirit animals in terms of writing. And I was in two different writers groups for a number of years. And I'm not sure I would have gone on in writing without that support. We read each other's work, we commented, we went to readings together, we commiserated over the manifold rejections that one receives when one is sending one's work out. And now, I'm still in touch with these people. I'm still reading. I'm reading now their multiple books that they now, many, many years later, have come out. They're, saying, yes, go Elise, when I have a new book come out. And just, it seems kind of miraculous to me to still have that. And I feel really, really supported by that, especially, not all writing days are good days. I mean, it's always a good day when you have a writing day, but
Mhm.
not all of those writing days are as good as other writing days, if that makes sense. So I highly, highly, highly recommend them. And especially, when you're a student in a writing program, that's one of the great benefits of being in a program is you're meeting other writers roughly at the same point where you're at. So, if you're in a workshop and or over the course of your years in workshopping in a program, when you find people who are good at giving feedback and feel you're kind of, you have an affinity with their work, or even if you don't, if they're in some ways that challenges you, I mean, absolutely, get together during the program. I sometimes think there are groups that were formed during the program, and then people who form groups after the program, and you might know those people, for decades, as you publish and as you work, maybe some people end up working in publishing or teach writing. So I highly, highly recommend it. It was really, really crucial for me.
So that, and then one other thing that you've mentioned several times that um, as really important advice to me is that it's not one and done. And there's a lot of time resting your work and revision. Can you talk to those of us who are emerging writers about um, the importance of giving our writing the time it needs and the attention? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really essential. I mean, I'm not the most patient person myself, and so I often live in a state of impatience with my own writing and wish it could be done, or wish this next draft would be the last draft I need to write. But then I look at it again a week later or 2 days later, and I think, oh, I'm still not done. So it's a hard lesson to learn. I know it is for me personally, and I think for a lot of people it is, but it takes it takes as long as it takes. And you know, the need to cultivate patience as well as stamina are just really, really crucial. Um, so for me, I'm a compulsive reviser. I go through, I don't know, 40 drafts maybe of a single story, and that can happen over a year. It could happen over 6 months, depending on my schedule in my other life of, earning money kind of thing, and having friends, which I sometimes forget about. But many, many drafts, and sometimes just setting something aside for 3 months
Yeah.
and picking something else up, because I have to realize I'm just banging my head against the wall, and it's just not healthy. It's not healthy for the story, whatever it is I'm working on. So having to just set that aside and work on something else can be much more productive. So giving things the time they need is I think absolutely critical. And so, when you're in a writing program, most people are, I don't know how long people, spend in a program, from at least 2 years. And some it can take, will spend more longer in a program. Um, and once you're done in the program, you're still probably going to go back maybe to your thesis, for example, and look at that anew, and expand that, develop that. You might change something. You might take some of it out. You might add something. So it's not like you finish the program and you are a bona fide writer, and
Right.
that you will always feel. I always feel that I'm still evolving as a writer. I like to think I'm still evolving.
Well, I want to come back I don't want David to think we neglected him. So he did ask that pesky question about how hard or strategies for finding an agent and publisher. So and I hear this often, but his question is, what are the challenges in finding an agent and publisher for short story collection? Is that different from a book?
Yes. For story collections, it does tend to be more of a challenge than, say, for a novel. Um, um, Short story collections, um, there tend to be fewer readers. More people will read novels than will pick up a short story collection and read a story collection. And as a result, agents and the large publishers are, their commercial concerns. They're concerned with you know, with making money and selling copies, and there's nothing, which is nothing, obviously nothing wrong with that. So it can be much harder to find an agent if what you have at that point is a story collection. Um, that said, short story readers are committed, passionate readers. They will, and they tend to be close readers. They tend to be very like kind of trained readers. They will read every word. And you know, so it can be very different than you know, the myriad types of readers of novels. There's so many, of course, different types of novels out there as well. But one of the things I should say to you is I know many, many writers who are very well published, who either win awards or are listed for the awards with story collections, who do not have agents. Or you know, the work was not sold to a publisher through an agent. So there are other ways of you know, you don't need an agent. It's not like have an agent or you have nothing. And I also know a number of writers who have, you know, by any rubric, successful novels out there. And when they have a short story collection, they go to a different publisher. They go to an independent publisher who very literary. So there's that to consider as well. You know, I love short stories. I also write novels. The new thing I'm working on is another novel, but probably my heart is with short stories. And I just think, you know, it's an art form in its own. It's not practice for the novel. It's not lesser than the novel. So I think if you're working on short stories and that's where what you're committed to right now and you're really passionate about, don't don't throw them out because you're worried that you might not get an agent. Send them to the literary journals. People will read them. Sometimes agents actually will read the stories as well. And this happened to me many years ago, and get in touch. But they want to know then, are you working on a novel? Is typically the way that goes. But you'll get publications, and the people who read the literary journals are passionate and committed. So you'll have like ideal readers. So that might not have been the answer you wanted to hear, but I hope you find that helpful. But thank you for asking that question. It is a burning question for so many people.
And Jane has a question here. Given the range of genre you've explored, short story, novella, novel, and dedication to character-driven approach, have you ever considered writing a play?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I have never considered writing a play. Um, I I tend to probably dialogue in my fiction is something I revise the most.
Mm.
So I feel that it's something that I work on very hard. So I feel like I don't have like this sort of gift, natural gift for it. And I guess because of that, it's always made me think, well, maybe a play would be taking on a little too much. Although I read plays and I certainly love seeing plays, but no, I haven't thought. Also, I love, you know, I love when a character can really go off and well, you know, you can do that in drama too. So never mind what I just said. But no, I haven't. Now you put that idea in my head though, so it's something I might think about. But I think probably I've instinctively shied away from that because I think dialogue for me is such a challenge.
So I love short stories, and I love also that they beckon you to be a close reader in the same way that poetry does, where every word counts and every word is necessary, you know, for it. So we're kind of coming to the end. And so could I ask you to read one one of your poems that are embedded in the penultimate story, I believe it is, the
Great.
um, Take 10.
Great. Well, thank you. Um, you know, I didn't so this is the second last story of the book. It's a character who one of the recurring characters. She's in a memory care ward. She has dementia. And most of the story is actually dialogue spoken by her husband, who comes to visit her nearly every devoted husband comes to visit her nearly every day. And he'll say something to her and she'll have, it's sort of an internal monologue. She'll just riff off something he said, but then just take it and run with it. So I'll read the first of her sections. 4 dogs at rest, silky and smart, coursers of rabbits and voles. The dogs' hot tongues hang, dogs out of reach, not for hand patters, not for a girl of 4, caged in nice, a girl who'd like to bite the bars. The seeds are already there. The dogs know best to avoid this one. Above the dogs, 4 crows on a branch ruffle their plumage. Do they know too? 4, the zither of horsefly, ravel of goldenrod, the cracked pot of a girl crotch, hot piss on a girl legs. Here comes mother, once in a field in June, in the early annals of Ivy Siegel.
Thank you so much. If does anyone have a last minute question? I know that Elise needs time to read all your incredibly kind comments that are in the Q&A. And Elise, is there anything that I didn't ask you or no one else asked that you would like to say to us now?
Just thank you so much, Susan. Thank you for your wonderful questions and your masterful guiding me through this. And also these questions that the audience is asking are really terrific. I hope I've answered them. I haven't gone on too long, but I really appreciate. I'm really touched by people coming and listening in and asking. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate everyone being here. Christmas gifts, holiday gifts, Hanukkah gifts, Kwanzaa gifts. Please support one another, and thank you so much. It was a delightful evening. Karen, you have any
I
wrap
just
up?
wanted to thank everybody for coming, and thank you, Elise. That was really wonderful. And watch your emails for our next author talk. So thank you, Susan and Elise.